welcome to Ask AE series. These are informal sessions with the Academy of Management Reviews Associate Editors. And our AE today is Paul Tracey from the University of Cambridge. Very warm welcome, Paul. Paul, you wanted to talk about phenomenon-based theorizing, but perhaps can you start with a brief introduction? I also, for the rest of you, Paul's presentation will be recorded, but we will stop recording before proceeding to Q&As. And if you have any questions while Paul is presenting, please put them in the chat, and then we'll take them after presentation. So welcome everybody once again, and Paul, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Dana. That's it's great to have the chance to speak with everyone about this topic. Yeah, my name is Paul Tracey. I'm a professor of innovation at the Judge Business School. I've been there quite a long time, 20 years. I've been at the Judge Business School. I had my first position as assistant professor there. And the work I do is on different aspects of innovation from an organizational perspective. I'm a macro organization theorist, do a lot of work on institutional theory, identity theory. I mean, the papers that I tend to handle at AMR so far are macro OT, and I also get quite a lot of entrepreneurship papers as well. So they're probably the main two topics that in terms of papers that I'm handling. So what I thought I'd talk about today is phenomenon-based theorizing, as you mentioned. So let me just get my slides up here. And I should say, as we start, that hopefully everybody can see the slides okay.
Yes.
So I consider myself a phenomenon-based researcher. I should say that at the outset. So both the empirical work that I do, plus the conceptual work, including the two AMR pieces that I've published, I would characterize as phenomenon-based. And I think, you know, as I reflect back on my career, I think I've always been a phenomenon-based researcher, right going back 20 years ago when I was starting doing work on community-based organizing. Right back at that time, I always felt that like mainline organization theory didn't speak very clearly to the issues that I was seeing and studying in community-based organizing. And there was a specialist literature in community organization, but it wasn't very theoretical. So I always struggled to frame the work that I was doing. And, you know, 20 years ago, if you framed your work in a kind of, or your questions in phenomenon rather than theory, there was a lot of pushback and resistance that somehow that wasn't proper research. But if you fast forward 20 years, I think we see a pretty dramatic change in the way that people think about phenomenon-based research and phenomenon-based theorizing. And at the current time, I would say there's a lot of interest in doing research and building theory in this way. And a lot of the papers that you see at AMR now are what you might classify as phenomenon-based. So it's a really interesting and important type of theorizing, I think, but it also comes with its own distinct challenges, as all types of papers do, of course. And so what I thought I'd do today in this short presentation is just do three simple things. First of all, to talk a little bit briefly about how I understand phenomenon-based theorizing, or how it's talked about in our field. Second of all, to specify three particular challenges that, in my experiences of doing phenomenon-based research and handling these types of paper, three particular challenges I think that authors face when they're doing this type of work. And then I want to just highlight three examples of published AMR papers that deal with these challenges really, really effectively, so that people can go in their own time, read them, and see what outstanding phenomenon-based work in AMR actually looks like. So that is the plan for this short presentation. So before I start, I should say there's a really good from the editor's piece, editorial piece on phenomenon-based theorizing by three A's from the previous team: Greg Fisher, Kalmar, and Shad Morris. And you know how they understand phenomenon-based theorizing is really close to how I understand it. I'm not going to say things that are radically different or extending what they say, but it is definitely worth reading this piece, because what they do is they interview 6 authorship teams who have published phenomenon-based research in AMR, and they asked them about their experiences, like how they came up with their idea, what the problems they had as they were developing it, the review process, and so on. And so I think it's a really great, or they provide through that analysis a really great set of insights into, you know, some of the challenges and opportunities of this type of work. So definitely worth reading, I would say. Okay, so what is phenomenon-based theorizing, and why might we want to do it? So I mean, I've used their definition. Phenomenon-based theorizing involves 3 different parts. First of all, the identification of a new or under-theorized phenomenon or problem or set of practices. Second of all, connecting that phenomenon or problem or set of practices with existing theories. While third of all, advancing these theories to account for the observed phenomenon. So I think a really distinctive feature of this type of theory building is the question that you're asking is framed in phenomenal terms rather than theoretical terms. But that doesn't mean to say that a theoretical contribution isn't important. And so this third point, about advancing the theoretical ideas that you're using to account for the observed phenomenon, that is really, really critical. So you know, if you're doing phenomenon-based work in AMR, it doesn't mean to say you don't have to build on these foundational theories. You do have to do that, but you're doing that through interrogating these new, emergent, unexplored phenomenon. And you know, I would say that sometimes there's not always a clear-cut dividing line between a phenomenon-based paper and a non-phenomenon-based paper. You know, all AMR papers have to connect with phenomenon in some way, but there is this distinctive type of paper where the question is really rooted in a phenomenon, and the theory building comes from interrogating and exploring that phenomenon. So why might we want to do this sort of research? Well, I think there are 3 related reasons that one might say that this is an important type of theory building. First of all, it's like some phenomena that we see in organizations, they're not easily or readily explained by existing theories. So it's like the community-based organizing example that I talked about in my own work 20 years ago. And that provides a great opportunity. If existing theory is not able to explain what you see that's happening in a particular set of organizations, that's an opportunity to build new theory, to build new understanding that I think is really exciting and interesting. Relatedly, like second of all, like the world moves really quickly in terms of technology, in terms of patterns of production, consumption, organizational practices, and it moves so quickly that you know, organizational theories sometimes struggle to keep up with that. And so to be relevant, one might argue, it's really important that org theorists are engaged with and trying to understand what's happening, and these new emerging phenomena come to the fore. And then related to that, I think, you know, this type of theory building offers a really interesting opportunity to bridge theory and practice, and to address problems that people in organizations are interested in and engaged in. And I think for many researchers, I include myself in this, you know, we want to have a conversation with our colleagues in the academy, but we don't just want to speak to our colleagues in the academy, we also want to speak to people in organizations, and we want the knowledge that we generate and produce, we want that to try to be used and applied by people in the world. And so phenomenon-based research and theorizing offers that opportunity, which I think is really important, and speaks to a broad concern amongst many in our community that we need to have this impact beyond speaking to one another. So I think phenomenon-based research, it is distinctive, and you know, you can do this in your empirical work, but when you're doing it in a conceptual setting like AMR, it's different again. So I just came up with 3 challenges that I think are particularly common in this type of work that I'm going to talk briefly about, and then I'll maybe try and talk a little bit about how they can be addressed, partly by showing 3 exemplar papers that I think have addressed these problems really well. So the first challenge that I think researchers doing this type of theory building face is to define, bound, and motivate their phenomenon of interest. And the reason why I think that's really difficult sometimes is because, you know, by definition, you're probably going to be studying phenomena that are maybe ambiguous, that are new. And so even to the researcher, it might not be super clear about the nature of these phenomena. And so it's really, really important to try and be as clear as possible in terms of what you mean, like to bound the phenomenon and to explain why it actually matters. And I think that whenever you're doing this type of research, there's always a challenge between the breadth of scope that you draw and how narrow and specific you're going to be. If you go too broad, then the paper loses focus and you don't have the space to build the type of granular theory that you need for an AMR paper. But if you go too narrow, then the paper loses interest and it becomes more difficult to answer the so what question, I guess. And so that challenge between how broad and how narrow you go when you're building your theory in a phenomenon-based paper, I think is really an important one to address. And I don't have an easy answer for how to address it. And partly it's just iterating your theory as you're building it to make sure that you're working with an appropriate number of concepts and constructs. The second challenge I think that's really significant and important to think about in this type of theorizing is the use of examples. Now, lots of AMR papers have examples. There are some AMR papers have no examples, but for the most part, I think examples are a really important part of a strong AMR paper. But what you often find, and I see this in the submissions that I get, and I also find myself fall into this trap in my own work, is that when people are doing this type of research, this type of theory building, they're using the examples to build the theory. And that's really problematic in an AMR paper because then it becomes something else. It's almost like an inductive case study rather than a theory building exercise. And so I think it's really important to think when you're constructing your papers that you're building your ideas, your theoretical ideas from different theoretical constructs. And the examples that you're using, they're to illustrate the phenomenon. You do need these examples because otherwise it can be difficult for the reader to connect with this new emerging thing that you're studying. But you need to be careful not to build the theory through the examples. And then the third challenge, this is one I mentioned before because it's probably the most important one, and that is the need to make an overarching theoretical contribution. So yes, you need to interrogate, explain, shed new light on this emergent phenomenon that we might not understand very well, but then you've got to make the link back to the theory itself. So I think like in my own work, I wrote a paper on social movement, how social movements support stigmatized group through social media with a colleague, Milo Wang at Arizona State. And as we were developing that paper, we were pushed really hard in the review process, not just to explain the strategies themselves and the way that these organizations use social media, but also to then connect back to the stigma literature and explain how our understanding of stigma was changed because of the framework that we were developing. And so that loop back to making a contribution to the theory is really, really important, really, really important. Okay, so these are the three of the key challenges that I would see in this type of work. What I want to do now is to give three examples. Now, these three examples of published papers, they're all fantastic papers, and they deal effectively with all of these challenges. But I'm going to talk about one particular challenge in relation to each of the papers. I should say that two of these papers were AMR best papers in their respective years, and two are also the focus of the Fisher et al. Editorial piece that I talked about before, so you can get more insight into what the authors experienced as they were writing these papers. Okay, so the first one is a paper by Kathleen Keeler and Jose Cortina, and it's about music at work. And I have to say, when I first saw this paper, I was quite skeptical about, why we've got a paper about music at work in AMR. Is that really an AMR topic? Is that really important? But when I read it, I was quite blown away by this paper. It's an absolutely fantastic paper. And one of the things that these authors do really, really well is to address this first challenge that I talked about in terms of defining, bounding, and motivating the phenomenon of interest. So what they do is to explain in a really powerful way why listening to music at work is a really important organizational phenomenon, a ubiquitous organizational phenomenon, and why it's a really important part of job performance that hasn't been considered. And so I think it's a really good example of, when we face this challenge about how we clearly define and bound a phenomenon, but also explain why it actually matters. This is a really good example of a paper that does that really well. The second paper that I want to highlight is a great example of phenomenon-based theorizing is a paper on rumour communities by Victor Siddell, Tim Hannigan and Nelson Phillips. And it's a paper about how rumour communities shape technologies and technology trajectories and the product development life cycles. And so it's really super interesting. And one of the reasons I think it's really interesting is the way that they use examples so effectively and avoid some of the problems that I talked about before. So there's loads and loads of examples in this paper, including a really cool example at the very beginning on how Apple introduced the iPad and the rumour community around that. But the examples are not used for theory building. They're used to illustrate in a really succinct, powerful, compelling way the points that are being made. So I think it's really, they do a fantastic job at that. And then the third paper that I would like to highlight is a paper on voyeurism. And this is the most recent winner of the AMR Best Paper Award. And it's a paper about how the authors see all these different businesses that are emerging based on voyeurism. And the interesting things about these businesses, they argue, is that they're creating lots of different value for themselves and for the shareholders, but they're doing it through violating or challenging dominant moral codes in a social setting. And existing theory, they argue, can't actually explain this or account for this very easily. And so what I think this paper does really well is this third point that I talked about before, was making the theoretical contribution to the bigger overarching theory. So in addition to explaining really clearly what these types of businesses are and how they operate, it actually has a really interesting contribution to the literature on value creation that they articulate in a powerful way. So I think it's really interesting. So that's the final slide that I wanted to talk about with regard to the presentation itself. So just to give you a sense of how I understand phenomenon-based theorizing, 3 particular challenges that I see in this type of theorizing, and then 3 examples of where this is done really well. Obviously, there's limits that what one can do in the short presentation to get into all the nuance of this type of theory building. But I think looking at both the editorial piece that I mentioned at the beginning and some really effective examples like these 3 papers I talked about, I think is a really good way for people who are new to this type of theory building to kind of approach it and to get into it.
All right, thank you very much, Paul. Very interesting indeed.